Every year, something quietly predictable happens. People work, earn their income, and then lose a significant part of it. Not because they made a mistake, but because nobody ever showed them another option. And the strange part is, they don't lose it because they're careless or irresponsible. They lose it while doing everything they were taught, working harder, following rules, and assuming the system is neutral. Because if this were just personal failure, it would be random, but it isn't. The same outcome repeats everywhere, which usually means the issue isn't effort, it's what people were never taught to see. And when something that important is missing from education, it's usually not an accident. Systems keep what benefits them, and silence is easier than explaining rules that would reduce what they collect. And yet, inside the very same system, some people lose far less not because they work harder or smarter, but because they were shown a different way to interact with the rules everyone else never saw. And this is usually where people assume effort explains the difference. But effort doesn't change outcomes when the rules themselves stay hidden. It just makes the loss feel more deserved, even when it isn't. And it isn't intelligence either, because plenty of capable, educated people end up in the same place, while others, no smarter on paper, quietly keep more simply by knowing which parts of the system matter. So when you strip effort and intelligence out of the equation, what's left is information. Who has it, who doesn't, and who was never told it existed. Because the system behaves very differently depending on that. And information like this rarely stays hidden out of malice. It stays hidden because teaching it creates friction. And friction slows systems that depend on predictable behavior and people doing what they're told. And the most uncomfortable part is that this knowledge does exist. It's taught quietly, informally, and early, just not to everyone, which is why outcomes diverge long before effort ever has a chance to matter. And most of the time, it isn't learned from books or classrooms. It's absorbed through proximity, family conversations, advisors, quiet examples, knowledge passed casually, long before anyone calls it a strategy. And this is where people feel cheated because it looks like a hidden game, but it isn't hidden or illegal. The rules are public, they're just written for people who already know what to look for. Making rules public isn't the same as making them usable. Complexity does the filtering automatically. The people who can decode it benefit quietly. Everyone else assumes it's just not meant for them. And complexity does something very useful for systems like this. It discourages curiosity, rewards delegation, and quietly separates people who can afford translation from those expected to accept whatever result appears. So over time, certain roles emerge naturally. People whose job isn't to change the rules, but to translate them. And access to those translators often determines who navigates the system smoothly and who never quite does. And the real advantage isn't having a translator at all, it's meeting one early, before habits lock in, before assumptions harden, and before people accept outcomes as permanent instead of adjustable. And this is usually where the first misunderstanding appears. People assume income is income, but the system doesn't see it that way at all. It separates money into lanes and treats each one very differently. The first lane most people ever encounter is the salary lane. It's simple, visible, and predictable. Money comes in regularly, taxes leave automatically, and very little is left to interpret or question. Another lane exists alongside it. Ownership, where money comes from assets instead of hours. It's less predictable, less visible, and because of that, the system gives it far more flexibility in how it's treated. And the difference in treatment isn't random. Systems tax stability heavily and reward risk selectively. Salary is predictable, ownership isn't. So one gets collected from automatically, while the other is encouraged carefully. Staying in a single lane isn't wrong. It's just limiting, because over time, predictability caps growth, while rising costs quietly outpace income, leaving effort constant but progress slower every year. And most people stay not because they're unaware, but because the lane feels safe, it's familiar, socially approved, and framed as responsible. Even when it quietly limits options, they'll only notice much later. Complexity triggers the same response as danger. When something looks hard to understand, people assume it's risky to touch, so they stay where outcomes are familiar, even if those outcomes slowly work against them. Risk feels different from complexity. Complexity looks confusing, risk feels threatening. So people avoid choices with uncertain outcomes, even when the alternative is a guaranteed slow loss they've learned to tolerate. And this is where definitions matter. Certainty only feels safe because the damage is spread out and quiet, while risk feels dangerous because it's visible even when it's smaller, measured, and temporary. Most people imagine change as a leap, but in reality, it's usually a series of small, reversible steps, moves that teach you something, cost very little if wrong, and quietly expand what feels safe. The mistake people make is thinking progress requires commitment first. But in practice, control comes before confidence. Small exposure teaches more than big bets ever could, without putting stability at risk. Before anything improves, people who win usually spend time watching how money moves, where it pauses, what triggers changes, because once you see the pattern clearly, decisions stop feeling risky and start feeling obvious. And once patterns become clear, something subtle happens. You're not forced to act, but you're no longer trapped either. Understanding creates options, and options are what actually reduce risk over time. And it's important to understand this part clearly. Strategies aren't hacks or tricks. They're simply paths the system already allows. Most people just never notice them because nobody points them out early. This is why two people can earn the same amount and end up in very different places because the system responds more to what kind of income it sees than to how much arrives. And this isn't generosity, it's incentive design systems reward behaviors they want: repeated investment, ownership, risk-taking, so money classified that way is treated gently to encourage more of it. When behavior runs against incentives, friction appears automatically, not as punishment, but resistance. Progress slows, effort increases, and people assume the problem is them, not the direction they've been pushing for years. And that resistance isn't random. Friction is feedback. It tells you where the system pushes back. Most people try to overpower it, when the smarter move is to read it. Once people stop treating resistance as an enemy, something changes. Instead of pushing harder, they adjust slightly, and suddenly progress feels lighter, not because the goal changed, but because the direction did. And the advantage that comes from alignment doesn't look dramatic at first. It's quiet, incremental, almost boring, but over time, those small differences stack and eventually create gaps that feel impossible to close. From the outside, this kind of progress looks dull. No big jumps, no dramatic wins, just consistency, which is why it's overlooked, even though it's the exact opposite of reckless. In investing, the boring approach usually wins: steady contributions, diversified assets, and time, while exciting moves create noise, taxes, mistakes, and timing errors that quietly eat returns most people never calculate. Most investors confuse volatility with risk. Price movement feels dangerous, but the real risk comes from reacting to it, selling early, buying late, and triggering taxes that permanently reduce long-term compounding. Long-term returns usually come from staying invested, not guessing entry points. Missing even a few strong days can flatten compounding, while constant timing decisions add stress, fees, and tax friction without improving outcomes. Every time a portfolio turns over, small costs appear. Taxes, fees, spreads, each one seems minor, but together they slow compounding year after year, creating a permanent drag that rarely shows up in advertised returns. This is why long holding periods are quietly rewarded: fewer taxable events, fewer fees, and uninterrupted compounding. The system effectively pays investors to do nothing, as long as they stay invested and let time work. In investing, results don't correlate with effort or activity. They correlate with exposure and time. The best performing portfolios often belong to investors who made the fewest decisions, not the smartest or busiest ones. Once mechanics are understood, behavior becomes the biggest risk. Fear, impatience, and overconfidence cause investors to override good systems, not because markets change, but because emotions interrupt compounding at the worst possible moments. Losses feel twice as painful as gains. Investors sell to stop the discomfort, but this locks in damage, misses recoveries, and reduces long-term compounding. Market declines don't permanently damage portfolios by themselves. Reacting to them does. Selling during downturns converts volatility into loss, while staying invested allows recoveries to repair and extend long-term compounding. Stable returns sound appealing, but they don't really exist. Once inflation, taxes, and economic cycles are accounted for, anything that looks smooth usually hides a slow loss of purchasing power instead. Inflation doesn't show up as a loss on statements. It shows up in what money no longer buys. Balances can stay the same, while real value shrinks, which is why protecting purchasing power matters more than avoiding volatility. When people say risk-free, they usually mean the price doesn't move, but inflation, taxes, and opportunity costs still apply, so returns can be stable on paper while real wealth quietly moves backward. Doing nothing with money isn't neutral. It's choosing the default outcome. Cash stays idle, inflation keeps working, and compounding happens elsewhere without you, even though the decision felt like avoiding risk. Most outcomes come from defaults, not discipline. Where money flows automatically matters more than good intentions, because whatever happens without effort compounds quietly, while manual decisions usually fade under stress and distraction. Automatic investing removes emotion and timing. Money is invested consistently, regardless of headlines or mood. Manual discipline breaks down under stress and market noise. Willpower fades under stress, headlines, and uncertainty. Automation doesn't. Once investing decisions are removed from daily emotion, money keeps compounding quietly, without hesitation, second-guessing, or perfectly timed mistakes. Timing decisions feel important, but they add more error than value. Removing them smooths entry prices over time, reduces emotional reactions, and lets compounding work without being interrupted by guesswork. Dollar-cost averaging works by spreading purchases across time, buying more when prices dip and less when they rise, which smooths entry prices without requiring perfect timing. Averaging reduces regret because no single purchase matters that much. There's no perfect moment to miss, which keeps investors from replaying decisions and abandoning the strategy. Most investing underperformance comes from abandoning good strategies. Behavior matters more than optimization. A simple plan followed consistently beats a perfect plan that breaks under pressure. Simple portfolios outperform complex ones in practice, not theory, with fewer funds, trades, and decisions, reducing costs, mistakes, and stress, making it more likely investors stay invested long enough for compounding to work. Every extra moving part in a portfolio adds another chance to make a mistake. Simplicity reduces error, which matters more than squeezing out tiny theoretical gains. Rebalancing isn't about chasing returns, it's about controlling risk. Over time, assets drift. and rebalancing quietly pulls a portfolio back to its intended shape, without predictions or emotional decisions. Rebalancing helps when it's infrequent and intentional. It hurts when it becomes constant tinkering. Too much adjustment increases taxes and costs, turning a risk control tool into another source of drag on returns. Over-rebalancing feels disciplined, but it quietly damages returns. Frequent trimming triggers taxes, fees, and lost momentum. Instead of letting compounding work, the portfolio keeps resetting before gains have time to build. Letting winners run allows compounding to do its job, but unchecked concentration increases risk. Trimming isn't about predicting tops, it's about keeping any single asset from quietly dominating the portfolio's future. Concentration can accelerate returns when things go right, but it also ties outcomes to fewer variables. Diversification doesn't maximize upside, it reduces dependency, making long-term results less fragile to any single mistake or shock. Diversification isn't about boosting returns, it's about reducing regret. When one asset struggles, others soften the impact, making it far more likely investors stay invested instead of abandoning the plan. Diversification fails when assets are highly correlated. They look different, but move together under stress. When markets drop, correlation rises, and portfolios built on surface variety suddenly behave like a single concentrated bet. Diversification fails when it's cosmetic. Owning many assets that respond to the same forces doesn't reduce risk. During stress, they fall together, revealing that the portfolio was never truly diversified in the first place. True diversification comes from owning assets that respond differently to the same events. Growth, inflation, rates, and recessions affect assets in distinct ways, which is what actually reduces portfolio fragility over full market cycles. Most long-term returns don't come from picking the right stock, they come from how money is allocated across assets. Selection adds noise, but allocation determines risk, volatility, and whether investors stay invested long enough for compounding to work. Long-term portfolios aren't built around predictions, they're built around constraints. Time horizon, cash flow needs, and risk tolerance shape allocation first, while returns are the outcome, not the input. Allocation comes first, but taxes decide how much you actually keep. The same portfolio can produce very different outcomes depending on where assets are held and how income is treated inside the tax system. Tax drag doesn't feel dramatic, it feels invisible. Small annual reductions that compound in reverse, steadily lowering net returns, even when the portfolio performs as expected. Income assets feel productive because they pay regularly, but those payments trigger taxes immediately. Growth assets delay taxation, allowing compounding to work longer, which often leads to higher after-tax outcomes over time. Dividends aren't extra returns, they're a transfer from the company to the investor. The share price adjusts, taxes are triggered, and the total value often ends up unchanged before tax, and lower after tax.
High yield often looks attractive on the surface, but unusually high payouts can signal elevated risk, and when those payouts are taxed annually, the combination of volatility and tax drag can quietly erode long-term returns.
When returns are distributed instead of reinvested, compounding pauses, cash leaves the system, taxes may apply, and growth resets from a lower base. Reinvestment keeps capital working without interruption. Compounding only works when capital stays intact. Each interruption resets the growth curve. Even small temporary withdrawals reduce the base, and future gains compound from a permanently lower starting point. Withdrawals aren't equal. Pulling from the wrong account at the wrong time triggers higher taxes and deeper compounding damage. Sequencing matters because every dollar removed changes what remains exposed to growth and future tax rules. Risk feels different once withdrawals begin. Market declines no longer recover quietly. Selling during downturns locks in losses, shrinking the base that future gains depend on, even if markets eventually rebound. The early years of retirement carry the most fragility. Losses combined with withdrawals reduce the base permanently. If markets decline early, the portfolio has less capital left to benefit from future recoveries. Buffer assets act like shock absorbers. They fund spending when markets fall, reducing forced selling. By giving growth assets time to recover, buffers lower sequence risk without needing market predictions. Cash feels safe because it doesn't fluctuate, but idle cash has an opportunity cost. It protects against short-term risk, while quietly sacrificing long-term compounding if held beyond its intended purpose. Fixed withdrawals ignore reality. Dynamic strategies adjust spending when markets fall, reducing pressure on portfolios during bad years. This allows higher withdrawals later when conditions improve and capital recovers. Spending flexibility works like insurance. Small temporary cuts during downturns protect the portfolio's base. Those adjustments feel minor short-term, but dramatically improve long-term survival without requiring higher returns. As income rises, spending often rises with it. Lifestyle inflation increases the retirement target quietly. Higher fixed expenses reduce flexibility later, making portfolios work harder just to maintain the same standard of living. Reducing spending before retirement lowers the capital required permanently. Every dollar not committed to lifestyle inflation reduces the withdrawal burden later, often having more impact than trying to earn slightly higher returns. Time is the silent multiplier. Dollars invested early compound through more cycles. Late contributions work harder but have fewer years to grow, which is why starting earlier beats optimizing later. Early contributions carry leverage that later money never gets. Those first dollars compound for decades, becoming the largest part of the final outcome, even if later investments are much larger and more aggressive. Waiting feels harmless because nothing happens, but every year of delay removes an entire compounding cycle. Money invested later must work exponentially harder just to catch up to capital that started earlier. The math of investing is simple. Behavior makes it difficult. Compounding assumes consistency, but emotional decisions interrupt it, turning reasonable strategies into underperformers. Emotional discipline protects your downside. It prevents mistakes that interrupt compounding, letting ordinary returns quietly outperform. Boring strategies work because they're survivable. They don't demand perfect timing or constant decisions. By reducing temptation to act, they keep investors invested long enough for compounding to quietly do the heavy lifting. Complex strategies promise optimization, but every added decision increases the chance of error. Simplicity reduces friction, lowers mistakes, and makes consistency easier, which often leads to better real-world outcomes. Every decision consumes mental energy. Too many choices degrade judgment. Reducing decisions preserves discipline, keeping investors aligned with their plan. Automation isn't about convenience. It's about removing choice. When investing happens automatically, emotion, timing, and discipline stop being variables, allowing compounding to run uninterrupted in the background. Most financial outcomes aren't driven by intention, they're driven by defaults, where money goes automatically, how accounts are structured, and what happens without effort determines results more than motivation ever does. Motivation spikes and fades, systems don't. Relying on feeling disciplined works briefly, but structural systems execute consistently, which is what compounding requires over decades. Willpower eventually fails because life interferes. Structure doesn't care. Once money flows through systems instead of decisions, consistency becomes automatic. Consistency feels boring because progress looks small, but repeated over decades, it creates a compounding edge. Doing reasonable things reliably beats doing impressive things occasionally. Progress feels invisible before it becomes obvious. Early gains hide inside the base. Most people quit during this phase, not because the strategy failed, but because results hadn't surfaced yet. Delayed gratification feels like loss in the present, but it permanently lowers future pressure. Every dollar invested instead of spent reduces the burden your portfolio must carry later, which is why wealth isn't built by intensity or intelligence. It's built by staying in the game longer than most people, letting time, structure, and consistency do the work quietly, while impatience removes others early.
And if long-term thinking makes sense to you, subscribe, because this channel is built the same way, slowly, consistently, without drama, just compounding useful ideas over time.